Remember, Reconstruction is really three construction. It's three presidents: Lincoln, Andrew Johnson, Ulysses S. Grant. It's three Reconstruction plans: Lincoln's 10% plan, Johnson's sort of Lincoln-esque but kiss the ring plan, and then congressional, aka military or radical Reconstruction. You've got three key amendments: the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th. And you've got three letters, or three times that one letter, K, K, and K. So when we start, we got to actually start during the war. So Lincoln was still alive, and it's December of 1863. And he's trying to figure out a way so after the war ends, whenever it ends, he can bring the South in as quickly as possible. And his goal is to really build loyal support in the South. So he says if 10% of the voters take an oath that they're loyal to the Union, they could organize a new state government. That government would be required to ban slavery, but those states could come back. Now, three states that were occupied by Union troops did apply to come back, but Congress wouldn't seat them, in part because the radical Republicans that were in Congress felt that majority rule was being discarded because Lincoln essentially made these plans on his own. Congressional response to Lincoln's 10% plan was a more severe Wade-Davis bill, where 50% of the voters in a state would be required to take an ironclad oath, namely that they had not only were loyal to the Union at that point in 1864, but during the war they had never been disloyal to the Union. Now, this bill, like Lincoln's bill, also would make it so that leaders of the Confederacy and military leaders would be disenfranchised. So in this particular case, Lincoln thought it was too severe, so he used the pocket veto, basically ignoring the bill for 10 days at the end of a congressional session, and even though he actually never actively vetoed it, it was done. So before the war ended, you had two plans: Lincoln's plan and then the congressional Wade-Davis plan, neither of which came to fruition. So Lincoln is shot in 1865 after the war is over. And Lincoln's death means a change in Reconstruction plans and a new president with Andrew Johnson, who no one ever expected to be president and who he himself never expected to be president. Originally, Republican leaders thought they could work with Johnson, who himself originally wasn't a Republican, but was a sort of a Northern Democratic sympathizer, even though he lived in Tennessee. But they didn't really understand what a white supremacist he was. Born into poverty, he really despised the wealthy planter class. He supported states' rights, much like his hero Andrew Jackson. Now, his particular plan was like Lincoln's, in that it would disenfranchise all leaders and office holders in the Confederacy, and particularly people who held more than $20,000 in taxable property. However, there was an important loophole here that Johnson, a guy who really hated the Southern aristocracy, really enjoyed, because he made it so that under his plan, he retained the sole power to grant individual pardons, which is basically an escape clause for these wealthy planters who could come to him, personally ask for this pardon, and he gave them out rather easily at that point. Much like the Wade-Davis bill, it required that a convention be called to repeal secession. You had to have a constitution written in the state that banned slavery, and you also had to say we won't ask the federal government for any money for state debts that were incurred during the Civil War. Now, Johnson pushes forward with this plan, and ultimately Congress, led by radical Republicans, is not happy with how easy it is for southern states to come back under Johnson's plan. As you can imagine, the cry of the North was, wait a second, why are all these rich Southerners able to go back to their pre-war style of life, having been pardoned? Why can they then assume political power after this war in which the North actually defeated the South? Now, we'll get back to what the South did in a second, particularly in terms of black codes, but it's important to understand the one organization that was set up by the federal government actually before the war even ended, earlier in 1865, before Lincoln was assassinated, whose goal was to help Southern refugees and freed slaves. So it wasn't just for freed blacks, it was also for poor whites as well. So the Freedmen's Bureau really is the first federal effort at social welfare. The goal was to provide food, shelter, medical aid, and more than anything, not only education, but also to help negotiate labor contracts between poor whites and freed blacks and richer whites, making sure that they actually had much more of an even playing field. Of all that the Freedmen's Bureau set out to accomplish, really the only one that it consistently accomplished was education for African Americans, which we saw all the way from kindergarten through 12th grade, and then most noteworthy were the development of HBCUs, or historically black colleges and universities throughout the South. Now, despite the fact that there were Northerners in the South helping as Freedmen's Bureau agents, states were actively working to curtail the rights of freed blacks, known as the Black Codes. Now, they were designed to keep freedmen in as close to slave-like condition as you could possibly think of. They prohibited blacks from either renting land or borrowing money to buy land. There were vagrancy laws, which if they weren't working, they could be charged with idleness and sent to jail, had to pay a fine, or actually go back to work. For many of the same masters that they had been slaves under. Blacks couldn't testify against whites. Blacks couldn't be out past a certain time in the evening. And it leaves many Northerners saying, wait a second, who won this war? It feels as if the South has risen again. They've been given the blessing of Andrew Johnson. No one seems to really be stopping them from doing this in the South. So many Northerners, particularly the radical Republicans in Congress, are inflamed. The goal of the radical Republicans, led by people like Charles Sumner in the Senate and Thaddeus Stevens in the House, was to make sure that freed slaves had as much economic opportunity and political equality as possible. And those particular guys really wanted to punish the hell out of the South and make sure that those people that had led the secession could never really have power again. So you're going to see Congress come back in early 1866, and they're going to look at these Southerners that have been empowered by Johnson, and they won't let them in Congress, much as they did with Lincoln during the Civil War. They're going to form something called the Joint Committee on Reconstruction, which is designed to look at what is happening in the South and say, over really the first year of this happening, is this working? And the conclusion that they come to is that the South seems to have risen again, and it does not seem to be acting like, in fact, it was the loser in the war. So the first effort they take is actually to extend the life of the Freedmen's Bureau, something that they pass in Congress. Andrew Johnson vetoes it. Then they pass something called the 1866 Civil Rights Act, not to be confused with the one that comes 98, 99 years later, which made African American citizens and allowed federal government to intervene to protect black rights. Johnson vetoed that as well. So they overturn both of those vetoes to make sure that A, they actually extend the life of the Freedmen's Bureau, and B, they pass the 1866 Civil Rights Act. And this is where there's a major miscalculation by Johnson. Johnson looks around and says, I'm not running in 1866. I don't run until 1868. But in the 1866 elections in November, he tries to travel around the country and drum up support for candidates that he likes, hoping to use his sort of presidential power. Well, what he miscalculated on is that as he sort of traveled around, he did so in a pretty uncouth and often either drunken or appearing to be drunken manner. So he actually worked against those candidates that he was trying to support. So in 1866, the radical Republicans did incredibly well at the ballot and actually came back in 1867 with such a strong majority that their opponents could never veto anything, so they held way more power than the president. At this point, the Sumners and Stevens of the world hold all the leverage. And they're going to try to reform the South in the image that they want. So they put the southern states under actually martial law, U.S. military control. There are 5 different districts throughout the South. And they require them to draft new constitutions. And in order for a state to be readmitted to the Union, it had to ratify the 14th Amendment. Now, the 14th Amendment actually is very much like the Civil Rights Bill of 1866. It was just a concern that if it's only a law, future Congresses and presidents could undo it, but if they actually made it part of the Constitution through an amendment, it's much, much more difficult to touch. So the 14th Amendment made it so that every male born into the United States, except for Native Americans, was a citizen. And importantly, it prohibited former members of Congress from holding state or federal office unless 2/3 of Congress voted to pardon them. So at this point, the North is doing what they can to really punish the South and give as much opportunity to African Americans. Now, at the same time that this is happening, Congress is having this unprecedented showdown with the president. They don't like Andrew Johnson. They have the power. So they're going to try to trap Andrew Johnson and then get him impeached and hopefully remove him. So using somewhat dubious legal logic, they say, well, technically, because the Senate has to ratify people that are in the cabinet, so namely when the president chooses someone to be one of his key advisors, the Senate has to give its approval. They said, we should have to give the same type of approval if you fire somebody. The person that Johnson was going to fire was a man named Edwin Stanton, who was actually Lincoln's Secretary of War, who'd stayed on in Johnson's cabinet. Now, Stanton was very friendly with the radical Republicans, and he didn't like Johnson, and in fact, he was giving information from Johnson to the radical Republicans. So Johnson fired him, knowing full well that this law, the Tenure of Office Act, prohibited him from doing it. But he was really challenging the constitutionality of the law. Now, the House of Representatives, who are the ones who did impeach him, and then it went to a Senate trial. Now, the Senate failed to convict him by one vote, meaning that while he was impeached, he wasn't actually forced to leave office. That being said, he was even more weakened by this entire process. And so in the election in 1868, which was actually surprisingly close between Andrew Johnson and war hero Ulysses S. Grant, Grant did win, and he did so mostly with African American support from the South. Now, technically speaking, there wasn't yet a 15th Amendment, which allowed African Americans to vote, but as part of this military reconstruction, there were efforts to ensure that African Americans could vote even before it was legally enshrined in the Constitution. The 15th Amendment, which did not give African American women, only African American men, the right to vote, was actually passed by the House and the Senate in early 1869 after Grant's election and was finally ratified the next year in 1870. Now, it's important to note that throughout the South, there were people that were helping African Americans have economic and political opportunity. You had the scalawags, who were the white Southerners who had been, in many cases, loyal to the Union and wanted to help African Americans get back on their feet, in part because it could sort of help the economy of the South overall. Then you had the carpetbaggers, people who stuffed everything in a carpet bag and came from the North to the South to do much the same, to help create political and economic opportunity. Now, these people were ridiculed by the Southerners as traitors and people who were working against the cause. Many critics of the carpetbaggers and the scalawags were actually white supremacists. So you see the rise of the KKK during this time period. In fact, many of the first people who were violently attacked and lynched by the KKK were, in fact, whites who were helping freed blacks. Now, it's important to note that the KKK was started by former Southern Confederate military leaders and did start sort of as a fraternal organization, but quickly took a dark turn. They felt most threatened by the fact that African Americans seemed to have political power, not just in terms of being able to vote, but also in terms of holding office. And throughout the South, African Americans were very involved in state legislatures. While there were no governors, they did send representatives and senators to Washington. And in the KKK's effort to restore the old political order, they threatened African Americans and whites were helping them. They burned houses. They killed people. They tried to use intimidation to keep blacks from exercising their new political power. During Grant's first term, they did pass something called the Enforcement Acts, which were designed to create heavy penalties for anybody attempting to prevent a qualified person from voting. They banned the use of disguises and actually gave the Army and federal courts power to capture and punish KKK members. That being said, the KKK did a pretty good job of sort of going underground. So it remained in existence, but did it sort of in much more subtle ways.